What if one simple act of kindness from your darkest hour came back to find you when you least expected it? Vincent Moretti hadn't thought about mercy in 15 years. He'd built walls so high around his heart that even he couldn't remember what warmth felt like anymore. But on a rainy Tuesday evening in October, sitting alone in a quiet diner on the outskirts of Philadelphia, those walls began to crack. The waitress approached his table with coffee, her hands steady, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Then she said the words that would change everything. "I recognized you from 15 years ago." Vincent's blood ran cold. In his world, being recognized was dangerous. It meant exposure, vulnerability, perhaps even death. But when she continued speaking, her voice soft and trembling with emotion, what she revealed wasn't a threat. It was something far more powerful, a memory he'd buried so deep, he'd convinced himself it never happened. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Vincent Moretti was 62 years old, though the weight he carried made him feel ancient. For 30 years, he'd been a man people feared, a figure who operated in shadows, making decisions that affected lives in ways both terrible and permanent. He'd risen through the ranks of organized crime through intelligence and ruthlessness, never allowing sentiment to cloud his judgment. But recently, something had shifted inside him. His wife Margaret had passed away 2 years ago, and their daughter Sophia barely spoke to him anymore. She'd made it clear she wanted nothing to do with his world, and he couldn't blame her. He'd built an empire on other people's suffering, and now, approaching the end of his career, the isolation felt suffocating. This particular evening, Vincent had come to Sullivan's Diner specifically because nobody knew him here. It was 40 miles from his territory, a humble place with vinyl booths and checkered floors, the kind of establishment that served meatloaf and apple pie to truckers and families passing through. He'd been coming here for 3 months now, always on Tuesday evenings, always sitting in the corner booth where he could see both exits. It was his ritual, his moment of anonymity. The regular waitress, Donna, had always served him with efficient indifference, which suited him perfectly. But tonight Donna was off, and a different woman approached his table. She looked to be in her mid-50s, with graying auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her uniform was clean but worn, and there was something in her eyes, a depth of experience that spoke of hardship survived. She poured his coffee with hands that trembled slightly, and Vincent noticed the worn gold band on her ring finger, the small cross pendant at her throat. When she looked at him, really looked at him, Vincent felt exposed in a way he hadn't experienced in decades. "I recognized you from 15 years ago," she said quietly, setting the coffee pot down. Her voice carried no accusation, no fear, only something that sounded like wonder mixed with old grief. Vincent's hand moved instinctively toward the inside of his jacket, where he kept protection, but her next words stopped him cold. "You saved my son's life." The diner seemed to fall away. Vincent stared at her, his mind racing through memories he'd locked away. 15 years ago, 2010. That had been one of the worst years of his life, when his organization was at war with a rival faction, when blood ran in the streets and decisions had to be made in split seconds. He'd given orders that haunted him still, orders that resulted in violence and destruction. What could she possibly mean? She pulled a photo from her apron pocket and placed it on the table. It showed a young boy, maybe 10 or 11, with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. "This is Tommy," she said softly. "My son. He'd be 26 now, working as a teacher in Pittsburgh, married to a wonderful woman. But he wouldn't be any of those things if you hadn't stopped that night." Vincent picked up the photo with unsteady hands. He remembered nothing. Or did he? A fragment of memory stirred. A rainy night. Gunshots. Chaos in the streets. He'd been driving through a neighborhood that wasn't his territory, fleeing from something. His mind had been dark with rage and fear, and there had been a boy, hadn't there? A boy in the middle of the street, frozen with terror as cars screeched around him. "I don't," Vincent started, but his voice cracked. "You stopped your car," the waitress continued, tears glistening in her eyes. "Everyone else was running, shooting, chaos everywhere. But you stopped. You got out, picked up my Tommy, and carried him to the sidewalk. You stayed with him until I came running from our apartment. You told me to get him inside and lock the doors. You probably don't remember. It was maybe 2 minutes of your life, but it was everything to me." Vincent's throat constricted. He did remember now, flashes of it, the boy's terrified face, the weight of a child in his arms. A moment where something human had broken through his armor. He'd acted on instinct, not calculation, and then he'd driven away, pushing the incident from his mind because sentiment was weakness in his world. "What's your name?" he managed to ask. "Claire," she said. "Claire Patterson. I've been looking for you for 15 years, not to cause trouble, but to say thank you. I've prayed for you every single night since then. When I saw you walk in here 3 months ago, I thought I was seeing things, but I needed to be sure before I said anything." Vincent looked down at his coffee, his reflection distorted in the dark liquid. He'd spent decades believing he was beyond redemption, that every good impulse had been strangled out of him by the life he'd chosen. But here was evidence that once, just once, he'd done something right. And this woman had been praying for him. Him. A man with blood on his hands. "I'm not who you think I am," he said quietly. "I'm not a good man." Claire sat down across from him without asking permission, her eyes never leaving his face. The diner was quiet except for the soft murmur of country music from the jukebox and the clatter of dishes being washed in the back. "I know exactly who you are, Vincent Moretti," she said, and the use of his name sent ice through his veins. "I'm not naive. After that night I asked around. I learned things. But you know what I also learned? That night wasn't an accident. You made a choice when you didn't have to." Vincent wanted to leave, to walk out and never come back, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the gentleness in her voice, so different from the fear or calculation he usually heard when people spoke to him. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying his secrets alone. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't contain. "That one moment doesn't erase the other things I've done, the lives I've destroyed. If you knew, I lost my husband to violence," Claire interrupted softly. "Tommy's father, Robert. He was killed in a robbery gone wrong when Tommy was just 8. I know about darkness, Vincent. I know about the evil that men can do. But I also know that on the worst night of my life, worse even than losing Robert, you could have driven past my boy. You could have let him die in that crossfire, but you didn't." She reached across the table and did something nobody had dared to do in years. She took his hand. Her palm was warm and calloused from years of hard work, and the simple human contact nearly undid him. "Whatever you've done, whatever you think you are, that moment was real too. That mercy was real, and it changed everything for me and my son." Vincent felt tears burning behind his eyes, a sensation so unfamiliar it frightened him. He was a man who'd watched people die without flinching, who'd made ruthless decisions without losing sleep. But this woman's kindness, her absolution for something he barely remembered doing, cracked something fundamental inside him. "I don't deserve your prayers," he whispered. "Maybe not," Claire said with a sad smile. "But I give them anyway. That's what mercy is, Vincent. It's not about deserving. It's about choosing love even when the world says you shouldn't." She released his hand and stood up, pulling her order pad from her apron. "Now, what can I get you for dinner?" "The meatloaf is good tonight." The normalcy of the question, the return to the mundane after such an emotional revelation, made Vincent almost laugh. It was such a human thing, this ability to hold profound truths and still worry about dinner. "Just the meatloaf," he said. "And Claire? Can I see Tommy? I mean, not if it would—" "He's coming home for Thanksgiving," Claire said, her face brightening. "That's 3 weeks away. He doesn't know about this yet, about finding you. But I think he'd like to meet you. He asks about you sometimes, you know, wonders who the man was that saved him." Over the next 3 weeks, Vincent returned to Sullivan's Diner every Tuesday, and each time, he and Claire talked more. She told him about raising Tommy alone, about the fear and the joy, about her faith that kept her going through the darkest times. She told him about her small apartment, her dreams of retiring someday to a cottage by the shore, the way she collected seashells even though she rarely made it to the beach. And slowly, carefully, Vincent began to share pieces of his own story, not the violence, but the emptiness. He told her about Margaret, about how they'd fallen in love when they were young and how the life he'd chosen had slowly poisoned that love. He told her about Sophia, his daughter, and how he'd failed her by choosing his organization over his family. He told her things he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. If this moment has touched your heart, if Claire's kindness and Vincent's hidden pain have moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Your support means everything, but as Vincent grew closer to Claire, danger began to circle. His second-in-command, a brutal man named Tony Marconi, had noticed Vincent's absence on Tuesday evenings. Tony had been pushing for more aggressive expansion, operations that Vincent increasingly found stomach-turning. Vincent had been pulling back, questioning orders, showing what Tony called weakness. And in their world, weakness was an invitation for a coup. On the third Tuesday, as Vincent prepared to leave for the diner, Tony confronted him. "Where do you go, boss?" Tony asked, his voice oily with false respect. "Every Tuesday like clockwork. You got a woman? A gambling problem we should know about?" "My business is my own," Vincent said coldly. "Don't forget your place." But Tony's eyes were calculating, and Vincent knew he'd made an error. In his world, patterns were dangerous. Predictability could get you killed. He should have varied his routine. But the truth was, he'd needed those Tuesday evenings at Sullivan's diner more than he'd needed safety. For the first time in decades, he'd felt human again. That night, as Claire brought him pie and coffee, Vincent noticed a black sedan parked across the street. His instincts, honed by years of survival, screamed warning. Tony had followed him, or worse, Tony had sent someone else. Vincent's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He'd led danger straight to the one place, the one person, who'd shown him that redemption might be possible. And now Claire was in danger because of him. "Claire," he said urgently, "you need to listen to me very carefully." Claire saw the fear in Vincent's eyes, and her cheerful expression faded. "What's wrong?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from him. Outside, the black sedan idled at the curb, windows tinted so dark that Vincent couldn't see inside. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. If Tony had followed him, it meant Tony suspected Vincent was compromised, weak, vulnerable. And in their world, vulnerable men didn't last long. "I need you to go into the back," Vincent said quietly, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Call the police and tell them there's been a threat. Lock the kitchen door. Don't come out until—" "No," Claire said simply. Her eyes were clear and calm, and her refusal stunned him into silence. "I've lived in fear before, Vincent. After Robert died, I lived in fear for years. Every sound, every stranger, every moment felt like danger. But you know what I learned? Fear only wins if you let it chase you into hiding. Whatever this is, we'll face it together." "You don't understand what these people are capable of," Vincent hissed, glancing toward the door. "I've brought danger to your door, and if something happens to you because of me, then it happens," Claire said with a strength that reminded him why she'd survived raising a child alone in a dangerous neighborhood. "But I'm not leaving you to face it alone. Tell me what we need to do." In that moment, Vincent saw clearly what he'd been blind to his entire life. Real courage wasn't the violence he'd wielded for decades. It wasn't the power to destroy or intimidate. Real courage was this woman, a waitress making poverty wages, choosing to stand beside a man who'd brought trouble to her door. It was the same courage she'd shown raising her son alone, surviving her husband's murder, getting up every morning to face another day of struggle. The diner door chimed as two men walked in. Not Tony, but soldiers Vincent recognized from his organization. Their eyes found him immediately, and the taller one, Marco, gave a nod that was almost apologetic. These weren't killers coming for blood. These were messengers, which somehow felt worse. "Boss," Marco said, approaching the table. "Tony sent us. Says you need to come back. Says there's business that can't wait." His eyes flickered to Claire, assessing, calculating. "He also says you've been keeping secrets. That's not good for trust." Vincent stood slowly, positioning himself between the men and Claire. "Tell Tony I'll be there when I'm ready. This is personal time, and I don't answer to him about personal time." "That's where you're wrong, boss," the second man, Polly, said with a cruel smile. Tony says there is no personal time. Not for you, not anymore. You've been slipping, making mistakes. And this? He gestured at Claire. This is a liability. The word liability hung in the air like a death sentence. Vincent felt rage rising in him, the old fury that had defined him for so long. But underneath it was something new. A protective instinct that had nothing to do with territory or power. It had everything to do with the woman standing behind him. The woman who'd prayed for him for 15 years. Who'd shown him that one act of mercy could echo through time. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between the life you've lived and the person you want to become? Have you stood at that crossroads where everything could change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. You go back to Tony, Vincent said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. And you tell him that Vincent Moretti answers to no one. You tell him that if he has concerns about my leadership, he can bring them to me directly. And you tell him that if anyone, threatens this woman or her family, they'll answer to me personally. Marco shifted uncomfortably. He'd been with the organization for 12 years, long enough to remember when Vincent's word was absolute law. But times were changing, and Tony's influence had been growing. Boss, with all respect, I don't care what you think. Vincent cut him off. Now get out. The two men exchanged glances, then left, and Vincent knew he'd just declared war on his own organization. Tony would see this as confirmation of everything he'd suspected, that Vincent had gone soft, that he was more concerned with some waitress than with business. There would be consequences, probably violent ones. When the door closed behind them, Vincent turned to Claire, expecting to see fear or anger. Instead, he saw tears streaming down her face. You stood up to them for me, she whispered. After all these years of surviving on my own, someone stood up for me. Vincent realized his own hands were shaking. He'd just thrown away everything, his position, his security, possibly his life, for a woman he'd known for 3 weeks. And the strangest part was, he felt free. For the first time in 30 years, he'd made a choice based on something other than power or fear. He'd chosen humanity. Claire, he said softly, I need to tell you everything, and then you need to decide if you still want me to meet your son. They sat in that diner booth until closing time, and Vincent told Claire everything, not the graphic details that would haunt her dreams, but the truth about who he'd been and what he'd done. He told her about the young man he'd once been, how he'd gotten involved with organized crime to protect his family from poverty, how each compromise had led to another, until he couldn't remember who he'd been before. He told her about the people he'd hurt, the orders he'd given, the moral lines he'd crossed so many times they'd stopped meaning anything. He told her about Margaret's slow disillusionment, how she'd looked at him with increasing disappointment until she barely looked at him at all. He told her about Sophia, brilliant and beautiful, who'd chosen to have nothing to do with his money or his name. Claire listened to all of it, and when he finally fell silent, exhausted from the confession, she said, Do you want to change? The question was so simple, so direct, that Vincent almost laughed. I don't know if I can, he admitted. I'm 62 years old. I've been this person for so long. That's not what I asked, Claire interrupted gently. I didn't ask if you can change. I asked if you want to, because Vincent, if you want something different, if you want to be different, it's not too late. It's never too late. That night, Vincent made a decision that would either save his life or end it. He called his lawyer, a man who specialized in making dangerous problems disappear, and told him to arrange a meeting with the FBI. He was going to do what virtually no one in his position ever did. He was going to cooperate. Not for immunity or witness protection, but for the chance to dismantle what he'd built, to prevent Tony and others like him from continuing the cycle of violence. He was going to tell the truth, accept whatever consequences came, and try to build something different from the ruins. The FBI was skeptical at first. Men like Vincent Moretti didn't just walk in and confess, but his lawyer negotiated a deal. Vincent would provide testimony and documentation about the organization's operations, and in exchange, he'd receive a reduced sentence rather than spending the rest of his life in prison. It wouldn't be easy. He'd still face years behind bars, but he'd face them with a clear conscience for the first time in decades. Tony found out about the meetings within 48 hours. The organization had sources everywhere, and betrayal of this magnitude couldn't be hidden. Vincent knew Tony would come for him, so he spent those days preparing. He wrote letters to Sophia, letters he might never be able to send, apologizing for the father he'd been and expressing hope for the man he was trying to become. He set up a trust fund for Claire and Tommy, hidden and protected, enough to ensure Claire could retire comfortably and Tommy could continue teaching without financial worry. He put his affairs in order like a man preparing for death, because he knew that might be exactly what was coming. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening, appropriately enough. Vincent had just finished meeting with federal prosecutors when Tony and 4 soldiers cornered him in the parking garage beneath the federal building. The irony of the location wasn't lost on Vincent. They were directly under the building where he'd been cooperating with authorities, and Tony had still managed to reach him. "You think you can just walk away?" Tony snarled, his face twisted with rage. "You think you can destroy everything we built, everything I've given my life to?" "You've given your life to causing suffering," Vincent said quietly. "I'm done with that. I'm done with all of it." Tony pulled a gun, and Vincent felt an odd sense of calm wash over him. He'd thought he'd be afraid when this moment came, but instead, he felt peace. If this was how it ended, at least it would end with him trying to do the right thing. At least Claire and Tommy would be safe. At least Sophia might someday learn that her father had tried, in the end, to be better. But then something unexpected happened. Marco, one of the soldiers who'd come to the diner, stepped forward. "No," he said firmly. "Not like this, Tony, not here." "You questioning me?" Tony whirled on him. "I'm saying there's been enough," Marco said, and Vincent heard the exhaustion in his voice. "I'm tired, Tony. Tired of the violence, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of being afraid. If the boss wants out, maybe he's got the right idea. If you've been moved by this story, by Vincent's choice to seek redemption and Claire's remarkable forgiveness, please subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories about second chances and the power of human kindness." 2 other soldiers lowered their weapons, and Vincent saw in their faces what he'd been feeling. The bone-deep weariness of living a life built on violence and fear. Tony looked around at his men, saw the mutiny in their eyes, and for the first time seemed uncertain. "This isn't over," Tony spat, but he backed away, the gun lowering. "You've destroyed everything, Moretti. I hope your conscience was worth it." As Tony and the soldiers who remained loyal to him left, Vincent realized something profound. He hadn't destroyed everything. He'd destroyed the wrong things, the things that should never have been built in the first place. And from those ruins, maybe something better could grow. 3 weeks later, on Thanksgiving Day, Vincent sat in Sullivan's diner waiting to meet the boy whose life he'd saved 15 years ago. Tommy Patterson walked into Sullivan's diner at exactly 3 o'clock on Thanksgiving afternoon, and Vincent recognized him immediately from the photo Claire had shown him. He was tall and lanky, with his mother's kind eyes and a warm smile that lit up the room. His wife Sarah walked beside him, her hand protectively on her swollen belly. She was 7 months pregnant, Claire had mentioned with obvious joy. When Tommy saw his mother behind the counter, his face broke into pure happiness, and he crossed the diner in quick strides to hug her. Claire whispered something to him, gestured toward Vincent's booth, and Tommy's expression shifted to something Vincent couldn't quite read. Curiosity mixed with emotion and perhaps nervousness. He approached slowly, Sarah staying close by his side. "Mr. Moretti," Tommy said, extending his hand, "my mom's told me so much about you, about that night." Vincent stood and shook the young man's hand, feeling the strength in his grip, seeing the life and purpose in his eyes. This was a man who made a difference in the world, who taught children and built a family and brought joy to his mother. This was everything Vincent's choices had never allowed him to be. "Please, call me Vincent," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And this must be Sarah." They sat together, the 4 of them crowding into the booth, and Claire brought coffee and pie. Her special recipe, she said, reserved for important occasions. Tommy told stories about his students, about the 10-year-olds who drove him crazy and made him laugh, about the joy of watching young minds develop and grow. Sarah talked about their plans for the baby, about the nursery they were painting and the names they were considering. It was all so beautifully, wonderfully ordinary, the kind of conversation families had over Thanksgiving dinner, full of love and hope and plans for the future. And then Tommy said something that made Vincent's breath catch in his throat. "Mom told me what you're doing, about cooperating with the authorities, about trying to make things right. I teach history, Mr. Moretti, Vincent, and one thing I've learned is that people aren't defined by their worst moments. They're defined by what they choose to do after those moments, by whether they keep running from the truth or turn around and face it." Vincent felt tears he couldn't control sliding down his weathered face. He'd spent weeks preparing for judgment, for condemnation, for the hatred he believed he deserved. But here was this young man, this teacher, this bearer of life and hope, offering him understanding instead. "I don't know if I can ever make up for what I've done," Vincent said honestly, "but I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying." "That's all any of us can do," Claire said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Try to be better today than we were yesterday. Try to choose love over hate, mercy over judgment, hope over despair." The conversation drifted to lighter topics, memories of Thanksgiving past, favorite foods, funny stories from childhood. For 2 hours, Vincent sat in that diner booth and felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: belonging. These people, who had every reason to reject him, had instead welcomed him into their circle. They'd shown him what forgiveness truly meant, not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing choice to extend grace where it wasn't earned. When it was time to leave, Tommy hugged him, actually hugged him, this man who'd saved his life without remembering it. "Thank you," Tommy whispered. "Not just for that night, but for now, for showing me that change is always possible. I'm going to tell my students about you someday, about how it's never too late to choose differently." In the weeks that followed, Vincent reported to federal prison to begin his sentence. It would be 8 years, possibly reduced for good behavior and cooperation. He'd miss Sarah's baby being born, miss the child's first words and first steps. He'd be an old man when he got out, assuming he survived that long. But for the first time in his adult life, Vincent Moretti slept peacefully. His cell was small and cold, but his conscience was finally clear. Claire wrote to him faithfully every week, letters full of news about Tommy and Sarah, about the baby girl they named Grace, a name that made Vincent cry when he read it. Understanding the gift of what they'd given her, she told him about the diner, about regular customers and changing seasons, about her plans to retire in 3 years to that cottage by the shore. She told him he'd always have a place at her table when he got out, that forgiveness wasn't just for that one moment of mercy 15 years ago, but for every day going forward. Sophia came to visit him 6 months into his sentence. She didn't say much at first, just sat across from him in the visiting room with tears streaming down her face. But then she said, "I'm proud of you, Dad. Finally, I'm proud of you." And Vincent knew that whatever price he paid, whatever years he lost, it was worth it to hear those words from his daughter. 8 years is a long time, but it's not forever. And when Vincent Moretti walks out of that prison as an old man, Claire will be waiting for him in that diner, with coffee and pie and the promise that redemption, real redemption, is always possible for those brave enough to choose it. If this story has touched your heart, if Vincent's journey from darkness to light has moved you, please remember to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about second chances, forgiveness, and the incredible power of human kindness. Thank you for spending this time with us, for believing that people can change, and for reminding us all that it's never too late to choose mercy over judgment, love over hate, and hope over despair. May you find your own moments of grace, and may you extend them freely to others who are seeking their way home.